Every species in the known galaxy tells stories about things they cannot kill. The Verity tells stories about deep space radiation storms that swallow whole fleets. The Kethare, my own people, tell stories about the ancient void beasts of the Outer Rim, creatures so large they bend light around their bodies as they move through the dark. The Sulhuri sing long, mournful songs about the collapse, a plague that took half their population in a single generation. Every species has its monsters. Every species has its myths. Humans tell stories about themselves. I found that laughable once. I want to be honest about that because I'm a scientist, and honesty is the first discipline a scientist must master. I dismissed it. I read the literature, reviewed the combat data from a dozen minor conflicts in which human soldiers had participated, and I concluded, with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 11 research cycles studying biological taxonomy and behavioral patterns across 47 recognized species, that the legends were exactly that. Legends. The kind of thing that grows in the dark spaces between real events, fed by fear and repetition until it towers over the truth like a shadow at noon. My name is Sailven. I am a senior xenobiologist with the Kethare Collective Research Division, assigned to the diplomatic cruiser Unmoved Tide. I have 4 upper limbs and 2 lower, a respiratory system adapted for high-oxygen environments, and what my colleagues describe as an unfortunately blunt manner of expressing conclusions. I prefer to call it precision. Words, in my profession, must mean exactly what they say. The day Sergeant Owen Reeves came aboard, I was in my research compartment reviewing survey files on Verity social hierarchies. I heard his footsteps before I heard his voice. That alone should have told me something. Our corridors are wide, smooth, and designed to minimize sound transmission. Most visitors move through them quietly without trying. Reeves's footsteps were not loud, not heavy, not careless. They were simply present in a way that most footsteps are not. A rhythm that said, without words, that the person making them knew exactly where they were and where they were going and had already noted all the exits. I did not think about any of this at the time. I cataloged it later, after everything, when I was trying to reconstruct this sequence of small signals I had ignored. I met him in the forward reception bay, where Ambassador Dorvesk was greeting our new escort. The human military had offered 1 soldier as a security attachment for the duration of our negotiations near the Verity contested zone. Ambassador Dorvesk had accepted with practiced diplomatic warmth. Several members of my crew had reacted to the news of a human escort with a kind of hushed excitement that I found, frankly, embarrassing. Kim Sale, our navigation officer, had actually gone pale when she heard the name of the unit Reeves belonged to. She whispered it to me like it meant something important. I looked it up. It was a designation, nothing more. A string of numbers and a name attached to a group of soldiers. I was not impressed. Reeves was standing beside Ambassador Dorvesk when I entered. He was, by human standards, not particularly large. My research told me he was within normal range for his species. 2 legs, 2 arms, a face arranged in the way that human faces are arranged, with 2 eyes set forward in the skull, which indicates a predator's ancestry, though I had noted that in my files years ago and never found it especially meaningful. He was wearing the practical, dark uniform of his branch of service, and he was carrying minimal equipment. A sidearm, a longer weapon secured across his back, a small pack. He was not wearing any of the heavier armor configurations I had seen in combat footage. I noted this, concluded he had packed light for a diplomatic mission, and moved on. He looked at me when I entered. Not at my rank insignia, not at the research badge on my collar, not past me at the room. At me. It lasted perhaps 1 second. Then he looked back at the ambassador and continued listening to whatever was being said. But in that 1 second, I had the odd sensation that I had been measured, filed away, not dismissed, not evaluated for threat, not regarded with the alien curiosity that most species show when they encounter Kethare for the first time. Simply noted, the way you note a door or a window, something relevant to be aware of. I told myself it was a human social behavior I had misread. I moved to my seat at the reception table. The briefing was standard. Ambassador Dorvesk outlined the negotiation schedule, the territorial sensitivities involved with the Verity delegation, the diplomatic protocols that all personnel were expected to follow. Reeves sat at the edge of the room and listened without moving. He did not take notes. He did not ask questions. He did not shift his weight or look at anything except the ambassador and occasionally the door. When the briefing ended, he stood, gave a short formal acknowledgement, and left to review the ship layout. Afterward, my colleague Finaler, our ship's physician, leaned toward me and said quietly that he found the human unsettling. I told him he had been reading too many war stories. He said that the war stories were why he found the human unsettling. I did not have a productive response to that, so I returned to my files. Over the following 2 days, I observed Reeves with the detached interest of a researcher who has classified a familiar specimen and is simply confirming prior conclusions. He ate twice a day at irregular intervals, which I noted as a minor adaptation behavior. He slept in one 4-hour block, which struck me as insufficient by almost every biological standard I knew, but humans have a documented capacity to function on reduced rest cycles and operational settings. So I filed it accordingly. He spoke rarely, and when he did, he used simple, direct sentences. He was not unfriendly. He was simply economical. He did not waste words any more than he wasted movement. And that was the other thing. The movement, or rather, the precise lack of unnecessary movement. Every creature I have studied has a baseline pattern of what researchers call ambient motion. Small adjustments, idle gestures, the micro movements that indicate a living being processing its environment in a relaxed state. Reeves had almost none of this. When he was still, he was completely still. When he moved, it was with a directness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of how certain high predator species move when they are not actively hunting but have not stopped being predators either. I told myself this was simply good military discipline. I had read about it. Soldiers train themselves out of unnecessary motion as a matter of professional habit. On the second evening, I passed him in the corridor near the observation deck. He was standing at one of the wide viewports, looking out at the star field. I slowed because I was heading to the same deck, and I observed him for a moment before he heard me and turned. He had not been simply looking at the stars. He had been looking at the reflection in the viewport, which showed the entire corridor behind him. He said, simply, that it was a good view. I agreed. I went to my observation point and looked at the stars, and I thought about reflections and about a creature whose relaxation looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from readiness. And then I told myself I was constructing a narrative around a mundane habit, and I opened my research files and got back to work. That night, I wrote in my personal log that Sergeant Owen Reeves was a competent professional with good military posture and some interesting behavioral adaptations consistent with long-term service conditioning. I wrote that the stories circulating among my crew were a predictable social response to an unfamiliar species in a high-stress diplomatic posting. I wrote that I expected the remainder of the assignment to be uneventful. I was wrong about that last part in a way I'm still, if I'm being honest, not entirely sure I have processed correctly. But I'm a scientist. I will try. That same night, Kim Sale stopped me outside the dining bay. She had that look she gets when she is about to say something she has been holding back for hours. She asked me, very quietly, if I had ever looked up the Battle of Thresh. I told her I was familiar with it in general terms. A conflict near the edge of the contested zone several years ago. Human forces had been involved. She told me to look up the specific unit designation that Reeves belonged to, their role in that battle. I told her I would do it when I had time. I was being dismissive, and she knew it, and she let it go with the look of someone who has decided not to argue with a closed door. I did not look it up that night. I had other things to do, and I was quite certain it would not change my assessment. I think about that sometimes now. The way certainty can feel so solid right up until the moment it doesn't exist anymore. The negotiations were scheduled to begin in 3 days. We were a long way from anything that looked like trouble. I slept well that night, which is the last time I can remember doing so on that mission, without something complicated sitting in the back of my thoughts, quiet and patient, waiting for me to finally pay attention to it. On the third morning, We received word that our route was being adjusted. There was a minor situation developing along the original flight path. Nothing serious, a Verity Patrol dispute that the diplomatic corps wanted a route around rather than through. Our new destination was a place called Nine Station. I had never heard of it. I looked it up. Nine Station was a commercial hub at the edge of the contested zone. It operated under a loose coalition charter that, in practice, meant very little meaningful oversight. It was the kind of place where several different species' legal systems overlapped without quite touching, leaving comfortable gaps in the middle. It was well-trafficked, economically important, and not entirely safe. When I passed Reeves in the corridor after the announcement, I noticed he had made one small change. The longer weapon that had been secured across his back was now carried differently. A minor adjustment in how it was positioned. Nothing dramatic. A small thing. I kept walking. I told myself it meant nothing. Routine precaution from a soldier entering a less controlled environment. Standard. Predictable. Nothing to read into it all. I was right that it was routine. I was completely wrong about what that routine told me about the creature following its own professional instincts in the corridor of my ship, moving toward a station neither of us had been to, in a region of space neither of us fully understood, completely without fear. That was the last thing I noticed before Nine Station. That he had no fear. Not suppressed fear, not controlled fear. None. And at the time, I thought it was simply how soldiers were trained to appear. I had not yet understood that for Owen Reeves, it was not appearance at all. It was just the truth. Nine Station announced itself first as a smear of light against the dark, the way all stations do when you come in from the deep lanes. Then it resolved into shapes. The long docking arms reaching out like fingers, the cargo platforms stacked at various levels, the running lights of a dozen ships in various stages of arrival and departure. It was busy. That was the first word I reached for. Busy. The second word I reached for, but did not say aloud, was loud. I have worked in research postings that were considered remote and uncomfortable by most KethRA standards. I'm not easily bothered by new environments. But Nine Station had a quality that I struggle to describe precisely in scientific terms, which is itself unusual for me. The best I can offer is this. It was a place where people expected things to go wrong often enough that they had stopped being surprised when things did. You could feel that in the air, in the way the station personnel moved, in the way even the traders and dock workers kept a certain amount of space between themselves and strangers. Not fear exactly. More like the low-level alertness of creatures who have learned, through experience, that comfort can end without much warning. Reeves noticed it the moment we stepped off the boarding walkway. I was watching him by that point. I will admit it with a degree of attention I had not applied earlier in the mission. He did not tense. He did not hesitate. He simply arrived on the station and immediately, without any visible thought, oriented himself in a way I had not noticed him do on the ship. He put the wall to his left. He put the widest part of the walkway in front of him. He placed himself so that Ambassador Dorvesk was slightly behind his right shoulder. And then he scanned the room the way you scan a document you already know by heart, but are checking once more for changes. All of this happened in approximately 3 seconds. I had been cataloging human behavioral patterns for 11 research cycles. I had published 4 peer-reviewed papers on interspecies behavioral adaptation under stress conditions. I had personally observed members of 7 different species in unfamiliar environments. And I had never seen anything move through the assessment of a new space so quickly and so completely that it looked effortless. It did not look like skill. It looked like breathing. We moved through the station to our temporary quarters in the diplomatic corridor, a term that implied more separation from the station's general population than actually existed. The corridor was connected to the main trading floor by a short passage that stayed busy at most hours. Sound came through easily. Voices, the movement of cargo, occasional disputes settled in the loud and efficient way that disputes get settled in places with minimal enforcement. Ambassador Dorvesk found it distracting. Finaler found it worrying. Kimsale found it interesting enough to make notes about. I found it professionally stimulating because the variety of species present was genuinely remarkable. Reeves found it useful. I realized this when I caught him on our second afternoon on the station, standing near the passage entrance with a cup of something hot, apparently doing nothing at all. He was watching the main floor, not scanning, not checking, not obviously working, just watching, the way a naturalist watches a habitat, taking it in, learning the rhythms, the normal patterns of movement and sound, so that anything that deviated from those patterns would register immediately. I recognized the methodology because I use a version of it myself in field research. You observe the baseline before you start looking for variations. You need to know what normal looks like before you can identify what abnormal looks like. He was doing this for the entire station, cataloging it, building a model in his mind of how the space functioned when nothing was wrong, so he would know the instant something began to go wrong. And he was doing it in his free time, with a cup of something hot, looking completely relaxed. I walked over and stood beside him. I told him I had been meaning to ask him a few questions for my research, if he was willing. He looked at me with that same quality of attention I had noticed in the reception bay, and said that was fine. I asked him what he was looking at. He said he was watching the docking crew on level 2. I asked why. He said the shift changeover happened every 3 hours, and the new crew took about 12 minutes to settle into their rhythm, and during those 12 minutes the observation angle from the upper corridor was slightly different. I asked him what he was looking for specifically. He thought about it for a moment, and said he was not looking for anything specifically. He was just making sure he would notice if something changed. I told him that sounded like a significant amount of mental effort. He said it did not feel like effort. I asked him when it had stopped feeling like effort. He said he did not remember. We stood in silence for a little while. Then I asked him how he would describe his job, in simple terms, not the formal description. He looked at the docking platform for another moment before he answered. He said his job was to make sure that nothing that was supposed to stay outside the protection of his assignment ever got inside it. I asked him what he did when something tried to get inside. He said he made it wish it had not tried. He said it very simply, without drama, the way you state a fact about a process. The way I might say that a certain compound breaks down under high temperatures. Just information, just the way things worked. I told him I appreciated the direct answer. He said most people found direct answers uncomfortable in his line of work. I said I found them professionally useful. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but it was the first expression of any kind I had seen on his face that was not purely functional. I went back to my compartment and wrote up the conversation in my research notes. I wrote that Reeves demonstrated a level of environmental integration consistent with advanced operational conditioning. I wrote that his monitoring behavior showed strong pattern recognition instincts that appear to function below the level of conscious effort. I wrote that his description of his own function was strikingly predator-consistent in its framework, and that this was an interesting data point about how human military culture had shaped individual cognitive architecture. Then I stopped typing and sat with that last line for a while. Predator-consistent. I had written it easily as a classification term, but I found myself returning to it in a way that I did not normally return to a filing term. Because there is a difference between noting that a species has predator ancestry, which I had noted about humans years ago, and noting that a specific individual in front of you has organized their entire cognitive approach to their environment around the sustained, effortless readiness of something that has never fully stopped hunting. I went back to my work. I completed a review of Verity's social hierarchy documentation and submitted it to the ambassador's briefing file. I ate my evening meal with Finaler and Kimsale in the common area. Kimsale mentioned the Battle of Thresh again. Finaler said he had read about it and was glad the details were classified above his access level because the summary alone was enough. They both looked at me to see if I had read it. I told them I had not yet gotten around to it. Kimsale said, very quietly, that I should. The next morning, there was a disruption at the docking level. I heard about it secondhand because I was reviewing survey data at the time. Apparently, 3 members of Verity labor crew had decided to discourage a pair of Kethar A trade representatives from using a particular cargo lift in a way that such discouragements happen on stations without meaningful enforcement, which is to say with bodies positioned in doorways and voices raised to an unambiguous volume. Reeves had been passing through the area on his way back from a perimeter check. By the time the trade representatives gave their account to station security, the 3 Verity crew members had left the area and the lift was clear. No one had been struck. No weapons had been shown. Nothing had technically happened. The trade representatives said that Reeves had walked over, stood at a certain angle relative to the 3 Verity, and spoken 4 sentences. They could not hear what the sentences were. Then he had stepped aside, and the Verity had decided to be elsewhere. I asked one of the trade representatives what exactly Reeves had done physically to cause that outcome. She thought about it carefully and said that she was not entirely certain. He had not done anything threatening, she said. He had just stood there in a particular way. And the Verity had looked at him standing there in that particular way and had made a decision. I said that was not very precise. She said she understood that, but it was the most accurate description she could give. I wrote it up in my research notes anyway. I classified it under nonverbal deterrence and social spatial control. I noted that the outcome was consistent with a high-confidence threat display, the kind that species with strong environmental awareness use when they want to communicate danger without escalating to active conflict. I classified it as a behavioral tool. Effective, I noted, but explicable. That night, I finally pulled up the file on the Battle of Thresh. I read for 2 hours. Then I sat still for a while. Then I went back and read certain sections again, because I had assumed on the first reading that the numbers were errors. They were not errors. I did not finish my evening notes. I turned out the light in my compartment and lay on my sleep surface and stared at the ceiling in the dark for what I estimated was approximately an hour and a half, which is not something I normally do. I'm a sound sleeper. I process information efficiently and do not tend to ruminate. But there is a specific kind of information that does not process efficiently. It is the kind that contradicts a framework you have been using confidently for a long time. It does not slot in beside the existing data. It sits on top of everything and changes the shape of what was already there. And your mind, rather than accepting the new shape, keeps trying to compare it to the old one, looking for the mistake, looking for the measurement error, looking for the reason the new data must be wrong. I did not find a reason. The data from Thresh was documented, cross-verified, independently recorded by at least 4 separate intelligence sources, including 2 that had no particular interest in making human soldiers look effective. The numbers were the numbers. The sequence of events was the sequence of events. At some point in the early dark of the sleep cycle, I stopped looking for the mistake and started looking at the data as data. And what the data described was this. At the Battle of Thresh, a small group of human soldiers had held a position against a force that outnumbered them by a ratio that, in every predictive model I knew, should have ended the engagement in under an hour. They held it for 11 hours. When relief forces arrived, 6 of them were still in position, still functional, still doing their jobs. One of the 6 had been Owen Reeves. I lay in the dark and thought about a man who cataloged docking shift changes with a cup of something hot and almost smiled at a direct answer, and who had 11 years ago held a position for 11 hours in conditions that should have been impossible, and who walked through Nyan Station in a state that was functionally indistinguishable from relaxation, but was not, I now understood, relaxation at all. It was not relaxation. It was the face that readiness wears when it has been readiness for long enough that it no longer needs to announce itself. I understood, lying in the dark on Nyan Station, that I had been looking at Owen Reeves and seeing a human, classifying him by species, measuring him against the data I had on his biology, his evolutionary history, his physiological limitations. And I had been wrong about the unit of analysis. You do not measure Owen Reeves against human biology. You measure him against what 11 years of relentless, deliberate refinement produces when it is applied to a species that evolved as persistence predators and then spent the entirety of their recorded history finding new ways to become more dangerous. I got up and went to the viewport. The station lights were dimmer in the sleep cycle. The trading floor below was quieter but not empty. A few figures moved between cargo stacks and corridor entrances. I stood there for a long time. Then I wrote a new entry in my research log, short, just 4 lines, that said my prior assessment of the subject required revision, that I had identified a significant gap in my analytical framework, and that I would be approaching the remainder of the assignment with what I described professionally as renewed attention to available evidence. What I meant, if I'm being honest, was that I was no longer certain I had been paying attention to the right things at all. I went back to sleep. I did not sleep well. Breakfast was quiet. I ate across the common area from Reeves, who was having his first meal of the day with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything else. He ate without looking at his food. He was watching the window that faced the corridor junction, not watching it the way you watch something interesting, watching it the way a motion detector watches a room. I noticed for the first time that I noticed different things about him now. Details I had cataloged and filed without considering what they added up to. The way the small pack he kept near his seat was always within one arm's reach. The way he sat at an angle that gave him a clear line to the exit without requiring him to turn. The way his eyes moved in a pattern, not random, not idle, a specific sequence that covered the room and returned to the same anchor points at regular intervals. I had seen all of this before. I had filed it under military conditioning. I had not asked what that conditioning was actually for, what specific and real-world purpose it served, what it looked like in practice when the thing it had been built for actually arrived. I was asking that question now. We had a preliminary briefing session with the Verity delegation representatives that morning, a small group, 2 officials, and an aide, meeting in one of the station's hired conference suites to establish the framework for the larger negotiation. Ambassador Dorvesk was at his diplomatic best, warm and precise, and careful with language in the way that experienced ambassadors are. The Verity were not unfriendly, but they were cautious. There were sensitivities around territorial rights in the contested zone that made the conversation move slowly, with long pauses while parties carefully selected their phrasing. Reeves stood at the back of the room near the door. He did not sit. He stood for the entire 2-hour session without moving, which I had seen him do before and had attributed to professional habit. Now I watched him during the long pauses in the negotiation and thought about what it meant that standing still for 2 hours was simply not a physical or mental difficulty for him. It was not patience in the way most species experience patience, which involves the active management of discomfort. It was stillness, genuine stillness, the absence of the need to move. One of the Verity officials glanced at him twice during the session with an expression I recognized from field research as a threat calibration look. The kind of look a creature gives when it is trying to determine whether something in the room is a danger and is not quite reaching a conclusion. Reeves did not react. He was not looking at the Verity official. He was looking at the door. After the session, in the corridor outside, Ambassador Dorvesk told me quietly that having the human present seemed to have shortened the Verity's usual opening posturing by about 40 minutes. He said this as though he was not sure how he felt about it. I told him it was probably because the Verity official had spent some of that posturing time recalculating. He looked at me with an expression that suggested this was not particularly reassuring. I told him it was not meant to be reassuring. He sighed and went to prepare for the afternoon session. Finaler caught up with me in the corridor. He asked me, in the low voice he uses when he does not want to be overheard, whether I had finally read the Thresh file. I told him I had. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that he had been a ship's physician for 14 years, and he had worked with members of 11 different species, and he had treated injuries of nearly every category. He said that in all those years, there was a pattern he had noticed. Most creatures, when they were hurt badly enough, stopped. Their body told them to stop. The pain told them to stop. The damage told them to stop, and they stopped. He said it was not weakness. It was a biological fact. Damage past a certain threshold shuts down functional capacity. It was true for almost every species he had treated. He said the Thresh file had made him curious about the upper end of that threshold in humans. He said he had looked it up. He said he wished he had not. He walked away down the corridor without finishing the thought. I stood there for a moment and looked down the corridor toward the conference suite and thought about thresholds, about what it meant to have a threshold that was somewhere other than where you expected it to be, about what it meant to be standing on a station with restricted oversight in a contested region in the company of a creature whose threshold for stopping was somewhere so far out that no one had located its exact position with any confidence. Then I went back to my compartment and opened my research files and instead of the survey data on Verity social hierarchies, I found myself opening a new document, a blank one. I sat in front of it for a long moment. Then I started writing, not a research report, but an honest account. Why I had observed, why I had concluded, why I had gotten wrong. I did not know yet what the right conclusion was going to be. I only knew that the framework I had been using had a gap in it that I could no longer pretend was not there. I wrote for about an hour. Then I stopped and looked at what I had written and thought, this is not even close to complete. There is still something missing, some piece I do not yet have. 3 hours later, I got it. I was not expecting it. That is the thing about moments that change your understanding of something. They do not announce themselves. They do not give you time to prepare your analytical framework. They simply happen, and you are inside them before you have a chance to apply any methodology at all. And by the time they are over, the framework you had before does not work anymore, and you're left standing in whatever is left trying to build something new from the pieces. Here is what I know about the moments before it happened. Reeves was doing a perimeter check. This was routine. He did them twice each afternoon, walking a defined circuit around the diplomatic corridor and the adjacent access routes. Ambassador Dorvesk was in his private suite reviewing documents. Finaler was in the common area. Kimsale was at her personal terminal running navigation calculations for our eventual departure. I was in my compartment, still working on the honest account I had started earlier, when I heard a sound that did not fit the normal rhythm of the station. It was not a loud sound. It was not a specific identifiable sound of the kind that immediately triggered alarm. It was more like a change in the texture of the ambient noise of the station, the way that a piece of music changes when a note that was expected does not arrive. Something was absent that had been there a moment before, and something else, something with a different quality, was beginning in its place. I became aware, in the following 4 seconds, of 3 distinct new sounds. A sharp impact somewhere down the primary corridor, a voice speaking in Verity at a volume and urgency that was not commercial or casual, and then the particular sound of our common area door being opened by someone who did not knock. And then everything happened very fast. What I can tell you with accuracy is this. I was at my compartment door in 6 steps when the corridor outside lit up briefly with the discharge of a directed energy weapon. I know it was a directed energy weapon because I have studied the signature pattern of the discharge in my research. I pressed flat against the wall beside my door and opened my communicator to broadcast to the crew, which was the emergency protocol we had been briefed on. My communicator gave me a static response. Something was interfering with short-range communication. That was new, that was specific, and it told me, with the cold clarity that fear sometimes produces, that whatever was happening was not random. It was planned. I did not know how many hostiles there were. I did not know their entry point. I did not know the status of the rest of my crew. I knew only that the communication was blocked, that weapons had been discharged in my corridor, and that somewhere on this station, someone had planned to be here at this moment and had planned for us not to be able to call for help. Reeves was somewhere on his perimeter circuit. I did not think, in that moment, anything as coherent as a thought. What I had was more like an awareness of the fact that there was exactly one piece of information in my current situation that was not entirely bad, and that piece of information was his name. I stayed flat against the wall. I breathed. The sounds in the corridor were moving, voices in Verity, at least 2 distinct voices, and the movement of multiple sets of feet on the station floor. I could hear, very faintly, something else. Something that was almost the absence of sound in a specific way, a silence moving through the noise like a shape through water. But I did not know what it was yet. I did not know what it meant yet. Then the door at the far end of my corridor opened, and something changed. There is no word in the Kethara scientific vocabulary for what I experienced in the next 4 minutes. I have checked. There is a word for the observation of exceptional predator behavior in field conditions, a research term, dry and clinical and entirely insufficient. There is a word for the cognitive state that results from witnessing events that contradict prior predictive models, another research term, more useful, still insufficient. There is no word for the specific experience of watching something that your intellect, your training, and your 11 cycles of professional confidence told you was theoretically possible, but that your actual living mind had never genuinely accepted as real. Watching it happen right in front of you in a corridor 12 meters from where you were standing, watching it and understanding. With the part of your brain that processes immediate physical reality faster than language can follow, that everything you thought you knew was approximately the size of a thumbprint on the actual surface of the truth. I will try to describe what I saw. The first thing I saw was movement. Not the movement of the Verity operatives who were still in the corridor with their weapons out and their attention on the diplomatic suite door. The other movement, the one that came from the direction of the secondary access hatch at the end of the passage, the one Reeves had identified on his first day aboard as the second priority exit from the diplomatic section. He came through it at a low angle, and he was already moving when he came through it, and the thing that I registered first before I registered anything else was the quality of the movement. It was not fast in the way I had expected fast to look. It was not the dramatic, high-speed movement of the combat footage I had reviewed. It was compressed, dense. Every part of it was exactly as much as it needed to be, and nothing more. No excess motion, no wasted direction, nothing that did not serve the immediate purpose, and it covered distance in a way that my perception could not quite track, because my perception was looking for the motion I'd been told to expect and was not finding it. The two Verity operatives nearest to him had approximately 2 seconds from the moment he came through the hatch to the moment they were no longer a factor. I watched this happen. I could tell you the facts of it. I cannot tell you quite how it happened because the sequence was too fast and too specific and involved a knowledge of exactly where to be and exactly when to be there that I did not have the framework to follow in real time. What I can tell you is that Reeves did not take a single step that was not serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Every position he moved to was both a response to what was in front of him and a preparation for what was behind him. He knew, before he was in a position to see it directly, where the third operative was. He knew this because he had spent 2 days learning the rhythm of the station and the layout of the corridor and the angles that mattered, and he was running that knowledge now the way you run a process that has been practiced until it operates faster than thought. There was a fourth operative near the suite door. There was a brief, difficult moment when the fourth operative had cover and Reeves did not. I watched this moment with the part of my mind that was still operating on my prior analytical framework and thought, with terrible clarity, that this was where the numbers would catch up. They did not catch up. What happened instead is something I have replayed in my memory many times since. Try to identify the precise decision that produced the outcome, and I keep arriving at the same insufficient conclusion. It was not a decision. It was a response to information that I did not have and that Reeves did have. A reading of the operative's attention and body angle, and the micro shift of weight that predicted what the operative was about to do before the operative did it, and an action taken in the gap between the prediction and the event in the window that was smaller than I would have believed could be acted in. The fourth operative went down. 2 more came from the secondary passage. There was a short, intense, and extraordinarily specific exchange that I will not describe in detail, because I do not have the vocabulary to describe it with accuracy, and I am not willing to describe it inaccurately. What I will say is that it ended with the secondary passage clear and Reeves moving to the suite door to secure the ambassador, and when he moved to the suite door, there was blood on his arm from a wound I had not seen him sustain and that he was not paying any attention to. He checked the suite. He checked the corridor. He checked the secondary passage. He issued a brief status report into a different communicator than the standard one, the kind that operates on a frequency that the jamming could not reach, which he had clearly identified as a possibility before any of this started. He gave the report in a flat, even voice with blood running down his arm. Then he went back and checked the corridor again, and then he looked at my door. I was still against the wall. I had not moved. I was holding my communicator and not breathing with the full capacity of my respiratory system, which I was dimly aware of and could not quite correct. He said, through the door, that I could come out now. He said I should stay close. I opened the door. He looked at me with that same single-second assessment he had used in the reception bay on the first day, checking for injury, checking my state, filing the result. He was already looking past me down the corridor before he finished. The wound on his arm was still bleeding. He had not acknowledged it at any point that I had witnessed. I wanted to ask many things. I was a researcher. Questions were my primary tool. In that moment, standing in the corridor of 9 Station with the sounds of the station beginning to return to normal around us, and my entire professional framework sitting in pieces around my feet, I could not find a single one. He said, again, that I should stay close. He said the situation was contained, but he wanted to do another sweep before the ambassador moved. I said yes. I followed him, and I looked at the way he moved through the corridor, now with a small awareness in every direction simultaneously, the way something moves when it is very good at knowing where it is in relation to everything around it. And I thought with the clarity that comes when you have just had your framework dismantled and have not yet built a new one, that I had been studying humans for 11 research cycles. And I had not known what they were at all. The lights in the corridor were still slightly dimmed from the disruption to the power grid. Reeves moved through the half-dark with total certainty. I followed him and tried to remember how to breathe normally. We returned to the diplomatic suite in 6 minutes. Ambassador Dorvesk was unhurt, shaken but professional. Finaler had been in the common area when the breach happened and had gotten behind a partition when the first discharge lit the corridor. He was fine. Kimsale had locked her terminal door and remained there, which was exactly the correct response. Everyone was fine. Everyone except Reeves had been protected by luck and proximity. Reeves was fine because he had structured himself across 2 days of quiet observation and preparation to be somewhere specific at the moment when specific was the only thing that worked. Finaler looked at the wound on his arm immediately. Reeves let him examine it. He sat on a chair in the common area and held his arm out with the patience of someone returning an overdue item to a storage location. Finaler worked. Reeves watched the door. Nobody said much for a while. Eventually, Ambassador Dorvesk asked Reeves how many operatives there had been. Reeves said 6. The ambassador asked if they were all contained. Reeves said 4 were on the corridor floor. 2 had retreated through the lower access passage, but would be picked up by station security because he had already relayed their exit vector to the emergency channel. The ambassador asked if Reeves needed medical attention beyond the arm. Reeves considered the question for approximately 1 second and said no. The ambassador thanked him. Reeves said it was the job. Nobody laughed. It was not said as a joke. It was said as the straightforward categorization of a completed task. I sat across the room and looked at him. He was still watching the door. Finaler was finishing with the arm. The wound was more significant than Reeves had been treating it, and I noticed Finaler looking at him more than once during the treatment with an expression that I recognized from the morning's conversation, the one where he had said he wished he had not looked up the threshold data. After a while, I got up and walked over. I asked Reeves if I could ask him a few questions. He said that was fine. I asked him if he had known what was going to happen today. He said no. He said he had known something was elevated, but he had not known specifics. I asked him what elevated meant, because it was not the term I would have used for what I had observed in his behavior on the station. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that certain environments have a texture that changes when something is being planned inside them. He said most of the change is invisible if you do not know where to look, but that some of it is in patterns, in the way that small things that normally happen at certain times start happening at slightly different times, or the way that certain people who are normally present in certain places are briefly not present. He said the station had had that texture since about 18 hours after they arrived. I asked him why he had not told anyone. He said he had adjusted his own patterns accordingly, and that had been the correct response to the available information. He said alerting the delegation without specific threat data would have disrupted the negotiation and potentially accelerated whatever was being planned. I sat with that for a moment. He had known something was wrong for 18 hours. He had responded to it the way a very experienced professional responds to partial information in a high-stakes environment, not with alarm, not with escalation, but with quiet preparation. He had positioned himself and checked his exits and identified his secondary communication channel and learned the station's rhythm specifically so that he would know where the change would come from. And when it came, he had already been ready for it. I asked him, very carefully, if he had been afraid. He thought about this. The honesty of the pause was something I appreciated because I had asked him a real question and he was giving it real consideration rather than a prepared answer. He said yes. He said the hours before it, when he could feel the texture shifting but did not have specific information, were the difficult part. He said the fear was most present then, in the uncertainty in the window between knowing something was coming and knowing what exactly it was. He said that once it actually started, there was no longer any room for fear because there was too much specific information to process and too many immediate things to do. I asked him what was in the room where the fear had been once the fear left. He said the next thing, just the next thing, one clear, specific, immediate task at a time. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it while we waited for the station security response. I thought about it while the collective emergency channel was established and the situation was reported. I thought about it while Finaler wrote up his medical notes with the expression of someone reconciling observed data with expected parameters. I thought about it when Kim Sale finally came out of her locked room and looked at Reeves with an expression she had probably been wearing on the inside since the first day she heard his unit designation, and simply said, "So the stories are true." Reeves looked at her. He said he would not know what the stories said. She said that they said that human soldiers were something that could not be adequately prepared for until you had actually seen one. He looked at her without expression for a moment. Then he went back to watching the door. I sat in the corner of the common area with my research pad in my lap and did not write anything for a very long time. I had been wrong. Not about the data, not about the biology, not about the physiology. I had been wrong about the unit of measurement. I had measured a human soldier against the biological specifications of a human being and had concluded, unremarkable. What I should have measured was 11 years of deliberate, relentless construction against whatever he had been before those years began, and I would have seen something that the biology alone could never have told me. You cannot measure what training does, not from the outside. You can only watch what it produces at the moment when the environment calls for exactly the thing that has been built, and understand then, with the particular sharpness of a lesson learned late, that you are not measuring the creature at all. You are measuring its shadow. We filed our official reports aboard the collective recovery ship 3 days after 9 station. The emergency channel response had been faster than expected, partly because Reeves had transmitted the exit vector of the 2 retreating operatives, which allowed station security to intercept them and begin a chain of information that traced back to the group responsible for the attack. Ambassador Dorvesk submitted a commendation for Reeves through the human military liaison. It was the longest commendation I had ever seen the ambassador write, and Dorvesk is not a man who uses long words when short ones serve. Finaler submitted a medical report. He showed me a draft before he filed it. The section on Reeves's wound management was written in the careful, neutral language that medical reports require, but Finaler had included a footnote that said, almost verbatim, that the subject's response to physical injury during and after the incident was inconsistent with the expected range of pain response behavior observed in most species at comparable injury severity levels. He told me he had worded it that way because the accurate wording was not something he thought would pass the review board without questions he did not want to answer. I told him I understood. I was having a similar problem with my own research notes. The truth was that I had opened a new file on my research pad on the second day aboard the recovery ship and had spent several hours trying to write an accurate account of what I had witnessed, and I kept arriving at sentences that, when I read them back, sounded like exactly the kind of thing I'd spent 11 cycles dismissing as embellished folklore. I kept making them smaller than the truth to make them sound credible, and then the smaller version was no longer accurate, and I would start again. I filed an interim report. It was clinical and documented and correct in every factual detail. It did not contain the part where I had stood in a corridor on 9 station and understood, in real time, that I had been studying humans for 11 research cycles and had never once actually seen one. That part I kept for this account. On the 4th day, the recovery ship reached the rendezvous point where we would transfer to our standard diplomatic transport for the return to Keth RA. Reeves was scheduled to be retrieved by a human military shuttle at the same coordinates. He would go back to his unit. We would go back to ours. The mission would be complete. I went to find him before the transfer. He was where I expected him to be, which by that point was not surprising. He was near the forward observation deck, at a viewport, not looking at stars, looking at the reflection. The reflection showed the corridor, clean and empty and exactly as it should be. He was checking anyway. I stood beside him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I told him that I owed him my life and that I was aware that was true in a more immediate and literal sense than that phrase usually carries. He said it was the job. I had expected that answer. I had been thinking about what to say to it. I told him that I had been a xenobiologist for 11 research cycles and had published 4 papers on behavioral adaptation across multiple species and had been, until roughly 72 hours ago, confidently certain that I understood, at a professional level, what human soldiers were and what they were capable of. I told him I now understood that my confidence had been based on a systematic error in my methodology, specifically that I had been measuring the input rather than the output, and that the output was something I did not have a research framework to fully describe. He listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the reflection for a moment. Then he said he had met a lot of researchers over the years who said they studied humans, and he had found that most of them started from the biology and never quite got past it. I said that was precisely what I had done. He said the biology was a starting point. He said the biology gave you certain things, certain materials to work with. He said what you built with those materials and how long you spent building and how honestly you were willing to look at what was not working and change it. That was the part that did not show up in biological surveys. I said I was going to have to revise a significant portion of my published work. He almost smiled again, slightly more visible than the first time. I asked him if there was anything he wanted to ask me. He had sat through 4 of my interviews and answered every question with patience and accuracy, and I realized I had never thought to offer the exchange. He thought about it. Then he asked me what it had looked like from my side. The corridor. I said it had been very fast and very complete, and that I had not been able to track all of it in real time. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had wondered about. I asked him what the question was actually about. He said that sometimes, in retrospect, he wanted to know if the work was visible, the years of it, the specific decisions and the mistakes and the corrections and the practice, or whether it just looked like something that happened. I thought about this carefully because it deserved a careful answer. I said that from the outside, it had looked like something that just happened. That was what had made it so striking, the absence of visible effort, the way it had looked almost easy. But I said that I now understood that the appearance of ease was itself the evidence of the work. That you only look like something simply happened when you have practiced the thing until the practice disappears into the performance. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was probably the most useful feedback he had received. The shuttle arrived 40 minutes later. Standard human military configuration, compact and functional. 2 crew members aboard, both in the same dark, practical uniforms. They greeted Reeves with a brief exchange that I could not hear from where I was standing. He picked up his pack, which had been beside him, already packed. Of course it had been already packed. He had probably packed it before he went to the observation deck. Of course he had. He stopped before he stepped onto the walkway. He turned and looked at me across the bay, the same single-second assessment he had used on the first day, the same quality of attention that filed everything it found and moved on. Then he nodded. It was the kind of nod that carries more than it appears to, the kind that means something was acknowledged and understood and would not be forgotten. I raised my hand in a human farewell gesture. I had read about it. I had never used it before. It did not feel as awkward as I had thought it would. He stepped onto the walkway. The shuttle sealed behind him. I watched it disengage from the recovery ship and turn into the dark on a heading I could not identify, carrying it back to wherever it was going, to whatever came next in the long, unfinished project of being what it was. I returned to my compartment and opened the file I had been writing for 4 days, the honest account, the one that kept producing sentences that sounded like folklore. I read it from the beginning. Then I continued writing. I did not make it smaller. I wrote it the size it actually was, and if the review board had questions about the sentences that sounded like exaggeration, I would sit in front of them and explain, as many times as was necessary, that accuracy and credibility were not always the same thing, and that in this case, the accurate version was the one that sounded impossible. When I submitted my full revised research report to the Collective Science Division 3 weeks later, it ran to 47 pages. My supervisor read the first 8 and called me into her office and asked me, with the careful tone of someone who is trying to be constructive, whether I had considered the possibility that my judgment had been affected by proximity to a high-stress event. I told her I had considered it. She asked me what I had concluded. I told her I had concluded that my judgment had been affected by 11 cycles of studying a species from a safe distance using biological data and combat footage, and then spending 10 days in close proximity to an actual operational example, and that the proximity had not distorted my judgment, but had corrected it, and that the correction was uncomfortable but accurate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would read the remaining 39 pages. I went back to my office and picked up the research pad and opened the file again. Not to add to it, just to read the last paragraph, which I had written on the final night of the recovery ship transit, when I had finally found the sentence that I had been trying to write since 9 Station. It said, "The legends about human warriors were not invented to impress other species. They were constructed over many years by people who had seen things that they needed to pass forward to the next generation who would encounter them, and who understood that plain language would not be believed, and who tried to build the truth into a form that could be received and remembered even if it could not quite be accepted. The legends were warnings, and even they were not enough. And the reason they were not enough is the same reason my 11 cycles of careful, rigorous, peer-reviewed research were not enough, which is that there's a category of real thing that language, even accurate language, cannot fully carry across the gap between the person who has witnessed it and the person who has not. There's a gap that only closes one way. You have to see it. I had seen it. I closed the file and looked out the window at the dark between stars, which is very large and has many things moving through it. And I sat with what I knew now that I had not known before. And I thought that the most important revision to my 11 cycles of research was not the methodology section or the data analysis or the conclusions. It was a single note at the beginning in plain language that said, "This field of study requires a particular humility that I did not have at the start of it. And I am recording this so that the next researcher who reads this work will perhaps have it sooner than I did, and will measure the right things from the beginning, and will not have to stand in a corridor on a station at the edge of contested space and have their entire professional framework dismantled in 4 minutes and 30 seconds in order to understand what they were actually looking at. It requires humility and attention and the willingness to be wrong about something you were very certain of for a long time in public without deciding that the wrongness was somehow someone else's fault. I had all 3 of those things now. I had earned them the hard way, which is, I suspect, the only way they actually stick.